and he is editor of the newly launched publication, Carnegie Politica. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Which is the successor to Carnegie.ru, which was the popular online publication from the Carnegie Moscow Center, which was a great resource until it was closed by the Kremlin at the beginning of the war, unfortunately. Alexander has also been a journalist and worked for 5 years in Russia's foreign ministry. So really interesting perspective, and thank you for joining us. In part for clarity, I'm going to refer to Alexander Gabuev as Alex and Alexander Baunov as Alexander. So if you hear me say your name that way, that's who I'm talking to. Thanks again, everybody. And thank you to Andrew Weiss for having us here. Andrew's a dear friend and perhaps the smartest person on Russia affairs that I talked to. Let me kick off with a piece, Alex, that you wrote in the Financial Times a few days ago, which really helps to set the stage here in this incredibly electric moment. We are 12, 18 hours from a planned address by Vladimir Putin that will, from the Russian perspective, formalize this annexation of occupied Ukrainian territory. This comes, of course, a week or 10 days after the announcement of the mobilization, which of course follows the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was clearly a major inflection point in this war. So many things are back in the mix after a period of a little bit of a status quo and such a dangerous moment, it seems. And so you write about all this in the Financial Times, and you say that Putin's recent moves are, quote, unlikely to deliver victory, but they do increase the risk of a potential collision between Russia and NATO. Later, you say that this combination of annexation and nuclear blackmail that we've been seeing from the Kremlin will make the US and European leaders, Putin's hope is that this combination of annexation and nuclear blackmail will make the US and European leaders rein in their military support for Ukraine and cause the West to advise Kyiv to abort its counteroffensive. So this is your initial assessment of Putin's strategy. I want you to elaborate on that and start with the core question of whether the events of the past couple of weeks put Putin in a stronger or weaker strategic position.
I think that the answer is that it's a weaker position, and that what we are seeing is his rushed makeshift plan B for this war. The initial plan was, I will take Kyiv in 3 days. That failed miserably because of bravery and skill of Ukrainians and huge amount of Western, American, and NATO support. And then the plan B was, okay, I concentrate the firepower, I concentrate my manpower on Donbass, I conquer all of Donbass, annex it, extend the nuclear guarantees. And because Ukrainians are either pressured to accept those terms, or we don't have a diplomatic deal, but I can pound Ukraine with 1 missile a week to prevent reconstruction effort. And at the same time, I use the energy leverage against Germany and the European Union to force them into abandoning Ukraine. That was the plan. And of course, he hoped to control all of the territory of Donbass. What happened in the past 6 weeks is the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which made him rush this and also force the mobilization. Because the question is, can you control Donbass without bringing more thousands of Russian men with Kalashnikovs? They are just to stabilize the front line. So the plan B is still something that he hopes for. Combination of this pressure, nuclear blackmail, and energy blackmail will force the Europeans to abandon and Americans abandon Ukraine, and will force Ukrainians to stop. My assessment is that neither will happen. Neither the Ukrainians will stop. They are very mobilized fighting force. They're a very mobilized society. And it's just not that they will accept anything less than the current definition of victory, which is restoration of their borders before Crimea annexation, reparations, and full accountability for the war criminals. And neither that the West will dump Ukraine. So Putin's options are worse, because what if his plan B is not working? He needs either to back down and say, I'm going home with all of the destruction on my tab, or he needs to escalate. And I think that unfortunately, escalation is the more likely outcome.
So we'll talk more about escalation and the nuclear threat. Alexander, I just wanted you to jump in on this and start with those top line questions. And what is the view in Moscow, do you think, of the position Putin is in now? Do you think he looks stronger weaker? What's going to happen?
Well, as I wrote my piece in Carnegie Political, you mentioned in the beginning, and it's our scholar Tatiana Stanovaya is publishing another piece today in Russian, and the English version will appear tomorrow. Well, basically, it's, of course, I agree with Alex, he is in a weaker position, even inside Russia, both in relations to the elites and in relation to the population. With the population, it's clear the years-long contract between, unwritten contract, of course, between, or agreement, we can say, the authorities, well, the Kremlin and the Russian people has been broken just several days ago. It was an exchange, a famous exchange of freedoms, political rights, even property rights somehow, if you are talking about the big business, to the security and I would say private life, private survival, the possibility to live for the people their own lives and to struggle for their well-being, for their prosperity. And Russians usually are very indifferent to the common space, to the public space. It's a country of fences, so many fences you see in the small towns and in the villages. So what's important is from the inner side of the fence. What's less important or totally unimportant is outside. This is, well, fence mentality somehow. And the state has come in this private space, has crossed this line right now, taking the husbands, the sons, the brothers into the army, which is the most severe violation of this unwritten agreement that the Kremlin had with the citizens. Well, in the elite, of course, it's this destruction of the balance. It existed before.
Let me jump in on this for a moment.
Yeah,
we've seen protests in Russian cities. Who does that still reflect a kind of relatively liberal, relatively Western urban elite expressing an anti-war sentiment, or do you think that the protests so far, or perhaps in the near future, will soon reflect more of that kind of wider popular opinion in a way that could be threatening to Putin?
Well, I would discern the protests and the other forms of the resistance in Russia. The protests we have seen mostly, I mean, in recent days, mostly in the larger towns in both capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there were almost the same people protesting now that protested in the end of February and beginning of March against the war. So when you see the narrative that now Russians started protesting because, they are going mobilized and they were not protesting against the war. So basically, the people who took now into the streets are the same or almost the same as we have seen in February and beginning of March before it became too dangerous to protest at all. But the other forms of the resistance, what is important, of course, in Dagestan, the Dagestan case is important. It's street protests we didn't see in the springtime. And in Dagestan, we have this phenomenon of big families, larger families with many relatives, and much stronger horizontal ties on the level of these big families and the whole villages and the communities. And they are protesting. It's an important thing. Another thing is the mass fleeing from Russia. Only, this morning I received 4 stories from my personal friends who were not very politically motivated citizens. I mean, they were not Russian, like turbo patriots or hardcore patriots or Putinists, but they were rather indifferent, or at least continued their normal life as long as it was possible. And now they left the country. One after queuing for 16 hours in Kazakhstan border, another one crossing the Norwegian border in the polar circle, and other cases. This is
and we see those
another
incredible
phenomenon.
the long lines of cars at the border. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to make sure that we get Andrea into this conversation. We can come back to this subject about what's happening within Russia, but Andrea, it's obviously such an important part of the equation. How is the Biden administration seeing this and likely to react, particularly in the nuclear context? We've heard nuclear threats from the Kremlin since, I think, February or March. They seem to come and go, but there's definitely seems to be a new degree of menace to what we're hearing. And there is this potential new justification that Ukrainian fighting on territories that Russia now claims to be its own soil could, at least, in theory, provide some greater justification for an escalated response. So how concerned do you think the Biden administration is actually about some sort of a Russian nuclear escalation, which can take a lot of different forms, of course? And what's the right way for them to respond to this?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say they're concerned. And we kind of saw evidence of that over the weekend. The White House, Jake Sullivan was on all of the major talk shows, as was Anthony Blinken. So it's clear that they're taking this threat extremely seriously. And you can hear that in Jake's comments. But I think at the same time, they're taking it seriously while kind of trying to be sober-minded and reminding people that the risk, I think, of Putin actually using a nuclear weapon remain quite low. And so at this point, and as they've articulated in the talk shows, they are trying to manage the nuclear risk behind closed doors. They are directly communicating with their counterparts in the Kremlin and issuing very clear warnings, I would say, about what would happen should Putin decide to use a nuclear weapon. What do you think
those warnings?
It's really, obviously Jake is being intentionally vague in public, as well he should, because I think what they want to avoid is kind of that tit for tat out in the public domain. Yeah. That starts to get really dangerous, right? When you're doing that out in a public space. So they're trying to be in public intentionally vague. I don't know exactly what the kind of content of those threats were. I would assume, though, that they would be thinking very seriously about military responses. I mean, I would hope that the nuclear response is off the table. Mm-hmm. But I think that they are likely contemplating very seriously a strong military response. And you can kind of see that in the language that they're using. I think they said disastrous, or, the language that both Jake and Secretary Blinken have used to describe the nature of the messages that they are conveying to the Kremlin is extremely strong.
I understand you don't know or won't tell us if you do know or have some sense, but do you think we're talking here about a direct U.S. military attack on Russian soil? I think
they would be contemplating it. I mean, I think it
would be no longer
a
proxy.
I think it would be something that they would have to seriously consider. A military attack on either the facility that launched the nuclear strike, the unit that was responsible for conducting it. I think that would be something that they would definitely contemplate. There's also, non-military measures that would certainly be on the table. They pale in comparison to that, but starting to move and think very seriously about actually seizing the central bank reserves, oligarch reserves, and using that money. Certainly, there are additional sanctions that could be put in place. I think doubling down on trying to build the coalition to push back, reaching out to the Indias and the Chinas and the African and Middle East countries that haven't implemented sanctions to kind of tighten the noose and increase the constriction on the Kremlin. But I do think I would, in a situation like this, I would think that military option would be on the table.
And one more on this. I mean, we have a very sophisticated audience. Anyone who's going to tune into an event like this will probably have a baseline familiarity. But I just think, to be clear, can you give us a little bit on, if you think Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, what would that look like? It's not lobbying an ICBM at Washington, D.C. What do you think is the sort of likely, plausible, early range of possibilities?
Well, it seems like the most likely, and I'd be interested in what both Alexes have to say. But I mean, a tactical nuclear weapon, either on the battlefield, it could be more of a demonstration effect over the Black Sea. Some people have said in the Arctic. To me, though, it seems that a demonstration effect would probably have less utility for Putin at this point, right? Because then he's crossed the nuclear threshold. He's elicited the international condemnation that would be associated with actually, using a nuclear weapon. And so if he's going to do it, if he's actually escalating and trying to change the course of the war, it seems to me that the most likely use would be on the battlefield and using that tactical tactical nuclear weapon.
The problem is that he is going down the rabbit hole, and the use on the battlefield doesn't necessarily change Ukrainian calculation.
Nor does a demonstration affect. And I agree. And I guess the one thing I would say too is just coming back from Kyiv. This is one point I wanted to bring up.
So just make sure people understand that you were in Kyiv this month, maybe 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Did you meet with Zelensky?
I did.
You tell me that? Yeah. So we'll want to hear more about that, but go on with the.
It relates to this nuclear question, which is in conversations with multiple different Ukrainians in different levels of government and even all across the kind of spectrum, is you hear to the person in these conversations that Putin's use of a nuclear weapon, the Ukrainians' view, is that it wouldn't change how the Ukrainians fight the war. It will not change the ultimate outcome of the war. It just increased the costs that they have to incur in order to get to the victory. Mm-hmm. And so, to Sasha's point, it's not, you have to start thinking, it is unlikely to change the course of the war. And I think that's why Sasha's saying his position is now weakened, because now he's mobilized, he's annexed these territories, and now and these things that he's done are unlikely to change the trajectory of the war. And he's created all of the problems that Alexander was just talking about on the domestic front.
Alexander, let me bring you in on this, because something that I haven't seen discussed is how the Russian public might respond to the use of a nuclear weapon. It is a shocking taboo, and in most countries, I think people would be horrified to see their government detonate a nuke. But do you have any read for us on how the Russian public might respond? Would they feel like it was justified? Is there a different kind of attitude towards at least tactical nuclear weapons in Russia? How do you think the Russian would Putin incur some kind of domestic cost by taking that step? Could it potentially even be popular? What is your sense of it?
Well, first, my impression from my context, remaining context in the Russian leadership or ruling elite, are that are trying to convince the rest of the world that they're completely serious, and that's why I'm a little bit cautious when I transmitting this signal, because I know that it's exactly the signal that they want to be transmitted. They are totally serious about using the nuclear weapon in the situation when, as they say, the Russian state, that means the Russian regime, is threatened seriously. Surprisingly enough, the idea of the use of the nuclear weapon has stopped to be a taboo, at least a discussion, as early as beginning of March, not only in official talk shows led and run by Russian propagandists, but I had some private conversation with people who you don't expect to be in favor or at least seriously discussing this, like some analysts from major state-run banks, who were talking in the same mood that we are in a sort of patriotic war. The West wants we surrender. They don't accept anything but our capitulation. So if it's our fate, it's our fate. So basically, they support this narrative that we don't want to see the world without Russia. We don't need world without Russia, as Putin said in one of his appearances in 1218, if I'm not mistaken.
And that's I think fundamental point, because Putin views this war as existential for himself, for his personal survival, maybe for the legacy and for his country. And that's why it's just unattainable that he will back down. Yeah. And because there is no diplomatic off-ramp offered or that's visible for him, he also believes that Kyiv is beholden to the US. And that's a fundamental mistake. But that's what he believes. He believes that all of the people that are talking to him, Chancellor Scholz, President Macron, don't control the events, and the person who controls the events is President Biden. Mm-hmm. So unless he gets a serious negotiation offer from him, he will need to escalate to get to this point. And unfortunately, everything else, all of the negative externalities there, are now increasingly irrelevant given the price.
Right. And I think you wrote in the Financial Times piece that assumption is mistaken, that the Ukrainians have a mind of their own. Among other things, Ukrainian public opinion is really radicalized. So, when you bring up the question of end games, possible diplomacy, restarting peace talks with US officials, they really don't want to touch the question. But one thing they say is the Ukrainian public is not even close to being ready for that. So they're, what are we going to do? So do you want to just elaborate on that? I mean, is Putin failing to understand that in your
I think
estimation?
that we see like the whole war is a major failure of Russia to understand Ukraine.
Yeah.
And to understand that this country is real. Its society is real, this nation is real, and then everything what Russia does makes the situation worse for itself because it just leads to a very strong national consolidation, increasingly based on anti-Russian feelings, which are strong and totally understandable given the terrors that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. The problem is that Mr. Putin doesn't understand that. And the use of nuclear war, like the way Andrea put it, like whether tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield, like artillery shells, makes more sense, or you want to have a demonstration strike on Snake Island, or you want to go all in after command and control centers in Kyiv. That's not the dispassionate discussion that we will have in the Kremlin when and if the decision is taken. And that's a big problem.
Yeah.
I think that the other thing that makes it, I mean, there's always this question of will he or won't he? And it is so hard to gauge from the outside, right? Because we're talking about a highly personalized political system, and we understand that President Putin is making these decisions. It was clear in Ukraine. And the thing I always return to is we all sat here and tried to assess whether or not he would actually invade Ukraine, right? And we could lay out all of the reasons why it wasn't in Russia's national interest for him to do that. And yet he did it. So it's the same thing. We can all sit here and make the calculations of why it's certainly not in Russia's or Putin's interest to use a nuclear weapon. But I don't know that that's exactly how he sees it. It's really hard to know.
And then the deal that's on offer for him is getting wars and wars for Russia. Like the deal that the Biden administration put on the table in January was the best deal that Russia could get, like with a lot of Russian long-term concerns at rest. The terms that Zelensky was ready to accept in Istanbul are much worse. But then what Zelensky is able to do now, given the hard views in the Ukrainian society and the military and the unlimited support in the West that he gets, is even narrower. So for Putin to turn the table, he needs to do something really dramatic.
Yeah.
And then the key problem here is that he might hope that mobilizing this force, bringing it to the battlefield, would at least stabilize and freeze the conflict. And he had consolation prize of these annexed territories. His problem is that Ukrainians are very likely to push, and with the amount of systems that they are getting, this untrained, ill-supplied force will be shredded in a matter of months. That's the very likely possibilities unless Ukrainians exercise restraint, which they don't want to exercise.
Andrea, on that, give us another beat or two, and we're going to turn to questions in just a few minutes. So I hope you're thinking of ones to ask. On your trip to Kyiv on this subject, what were your impressions? Do you feel like there's how much synchronicity is there between Kyiv and the Biden administration? And if there are gaps, where are they? How big an issue is this?
I think, so obviously my trip took place before the mobilization and the illegal annexation of these Ukrainian territories. So we were there in that moment where there was a lot of euphoria with the success of the counteroffensive near Kharkiv. But for me, the trip underscored this assessment where, and I do think that there's kind of a growing consensus within the analytic community that time favors Ukraine, that the long-term trends of this war favor Ukraine. And there were, now with the counteroffensive, that they had just demonstrated their ability to retake territory. But for me, it was more like on a societal level. So we had the opportunity to go out to Bucha and Irpin, which are the towns where there were really these horrific atrocities against Ukrainian civilians. And they're rebuilding entirely. There's kids walking around on the streets and they're cleaning things up, and affordable housing is being built and people are returning. And the same was true in Kyiv. There's traffic and people in restaurants. So there was like this level of a societal resilience, and that's something I understood intellectually. And to your point, I think it's something like 97% of Ukrainians believe they will win the war, and a majority don't favor any territorial concessions. So you can understand that kind of intellectually, but being there and talking to Ukrainians, they are going to win the war, and they will incur the cost. And if it's a nuclear weapon, that's not going to change how they fight, just the cost to get there. So that was my overarching kind of takeaway. I didn't, I think the other thing is, I think that Zelensky's, I don't want to call it a gambit, but his understanding about this attempt to do the counteroffensive, I think paid off. Mm-hmm. So not only were they able to retake the territory, but I do get the sense that their ability to demonstrate the capacity to retake territory has energized the Biden administration, Europeans. I think he was definitely worried about going into this long, cold winter without being able to demonstrate that. And I think, I kind of feel it here in Washington, this, again, returning to a belief that eventually Ukraine can win. And I think it is energizing what we're willing to do to support them with military aid, economic aid, et cetera, and in Europe.
Quickly, and I'll go to Alexandra. Go ahead.
Problem here is that exactly that belief brings about the Russian radical options to counter that. And like here is the escalation ladder, because we are few steps away from use of nukes. Like he can use more Air Force, he can use chem weapons on the battlefield, he can use the high precision missiles that are still in stock to bombard Ukrainian infrastructure. And then if all that fails, he climbs up. The problem is that as this happens, it will not work. But the amount of damage, destruction, and death it will create is just astonishing.
Alexandra, Andrea said something that struck me, which is there's a growing consensus in the analytic community that time is on the Ukrainian side. And I wonder if you could talk from the perspective of the Russian side. How does time look in terms of the Russian economy? There's a debate about how much of a bite the sanctions are having. There's one school of thought that, Russia's proven very resilient. The sanctions are really not going to change Putin's behavior. But there's a kind of contrarian view that says really over time, they're going to take a severe toll. They're going to be impossible to manage. And I just wonder how you look at the longer term, particularly from an economic standpoint. What is your assessment of the damage the sanctions are doing? By the way, particularly as oil prices are falling, which changes the calculus, no doubt.
Clear divide between what Putin says and what some professional economists are saying. Putin stated on several occasions that Russia has won the sanctions war, that the economy has been stabilized, that the economic growth will be back soon, and we will replace everything we are going to replace. It all will just favor our economy. The reports of even, official Russian economic institutions are not that optimistic, but in two respects, we are in a unique situation when we are talking about the sanctions. First, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is still a market economy. It's a capitalist country. That means that Russia really produce all, or at least import from third countries, not only from the West, all these goods and foods that were in shortage during the Soviet time. And that basically made the ordinary people being disappointed in the system and in the state they are living in. It's not the case of Russia. If you go, I have not been in Moscow since the beginning of the war, but whatever I see, read, and in my private conversations with everybody who was there, that's almost 100% normal life. Of course, all sanctions have midterm, long-term effects, but not right now. The second difference between now and the Soviet time is that the technological sanctions may be very effective against countries like Russia with setbacks in technologies. But in the modern world, in the present world, there are two major sources of technologies. Before a couple of decades, it was only the West. Now it's the West and China. And China is still ready to provide Russia with technologies.
Yeah, thank you for segueing to the next topic I wanted to broach. And I'll go to you on this, Alex, which is China. There's so many ways to talk about China's role here. It seems to me that, let me start over. What do you think Xi Jinping is thinking right now? We've seen some hints of frustration and discontent. What do you think he's likely to do? And I also wonder in particular, how is he likely to respond to a Russian nuclear weapon use? That seems to me like a potential big cost for Putin. But maybe he doesn't care. Tell me how you see it.
First, China sees Putin's foreign policy as a kind of natural catastrophe like typhoon that you cannot control. You can only adapt and hedge the risk, hide, and then maybe maximize your opportunities. That's first. B, the paramount bilateral relationship that has real importance for China is China-US. And when they're looking at their relationship with Russia, which also has importance, they're thinking, okay, if we throw Vladimir Putin under the bus, does it result in any fundamental change of US-China relationship? Does it mean that president sticks to one China policy again? Does it mean that the US doesn't speak about atrocities in Xinjiang or state of democracy in Hong Kong? And the clear answer is no. So if they help the US to deliver strategic defeat to Russia and then maybe get rid of Vladimir Putin, you might have a pro-Western regime in Russia, which is a strategic nightmare, right? That's their calculus. And then third part is long-term shift of Russia towards a junior partner of China, increasingly beholden to China, is an asset for them given the trend line in the US-China relationship. So yes, all of the criticism and frustration in the European Union is causing Xi Jinping some trouble. I think he is very carefully sitting not only on the fence, which is really uncomfortable, I've never done that, but like on a Great Wall of China, where you can, whenever people push, you say like, yeah, I support territorial integrity of Ukraine, of course, and rule of law and sovereignty, and I don't recognize these little statelets. It's absolutely illegal. And at the same time, you do buy Russian oil, you do buy Russian gas at hefty discounts, but you are providing a lifeline for the regime to stay afloat. And I think that my problem here, if Putin goes nuclear in Ukraine, Xi Jinping might call him and say like, it's a very bad move, and they may publicly condemn it. Whether he will join a diplomatic effort to try to dissuade him and to say, if you do this, not a single drop of Russian oil will be in Chinese market. And then with the price cap and stuff, like your regime is unsurvivable, so better not do that. In order to make this happen, the US needs to have a proactive approach and probably have not only sticks and criticism, but also carrots, which is unlikely to happen. So I don't expect Xi Jinping to somehow come and fix this problem. This is a magical thinking.
Yeah. The other big actor here, this will be my last before we start to take questions from the audience, is for you, Andrea. You touched on the long winter ahead and the question of European resilience. I just wonder if you could talk a little more about that because it's such a central question. I mean, first of all, how bad do you think the winter is going to be? You know, you see varying estimates similar with the Russian sanctions. There was a discouraging article in the Wall Street Journal today that made it sound like Germany's economy was really in big trouble. So is Europe going to make it through this winter? How is that going to happen? And if not, what are the implications?
Yeah, I think they will make it through the winter. I mean, we don't want to kid ourselves to think it's going to be a cakewalk or easy with all of the high energy prices and inflation and everything else. And we've already seen, and it's not even cold yet, these little protests in Prague and some parts of Germany. So there is some pressure amongst citizens who are really feeling the pinch of all of this, putting pressure on their governments to do less to support Ukraine. So that will definitely be something that governments have to manage. But you do see tremendous leadership in some of the North European countries who are communicating to their citizens the importance of bearing higher energy prices and inflation, you know, along the lines of, you know, we can pay more for certain things while Ukrainians are paying their lives in order to defend, you know, our values and democracy and everything else. So, and I do get the sense that even in Germany, there have been some polls that do suggest that a large swath of Germans are willing to incur some costs in order to sustain the support. So I'm optimistic. And I think the one thing that will also help quite a lot is the more aggressive that Putin gets, I think the easier the cohesion will be. And thinking of like the attacks on the gas pipelines and other things, I think the worse Putin acts, the more he escalates in Ukraine, the easier it will be for the Europeans to maintain the cohesion. But it will be hard. I mean, and then the other thing is, On the nuclear question, also, I just had an interesting conversation with folks who are following Italian politics quite close to try to understand how that nuclear threat, the saber rattling, is playing out. That'll be another tricky issue for governments to manage, because I do think it is having somewhat of a polarizing effect, whereas those Europeans who were all in to support Ukraine aren't going to be deterred by the nuclear saber rattling, but those who were maybe a little bit more skeptical, maybe more inclined to pressure the Ukrainians to negotiate, will see this as kind of vindication for their views. So there is a little bit, I think, of a polarizing effect of these nuclear threats, which then, in a democratic society can make things difficult. But
just very quick two fingers on this. On Carnegie Politica, we have a new colleague, Sergei Vakulenko, who is like 3 decades experience with global and Russian energy companies. And his view is also that this winter will be hard, and next winter will be much harder for Germany in particular, because the storage will be depleted, and then there will be no new Russian gas coming. And then the LNG that can supplant this gas might not come before 2025. Doesn't matter that the political objectives of Putin will be achieved, but that's the pattern we've seen. So his plan A for this war, plan B for this war is not working, but creating a lot of damage. So the energy front is very similar. So the political goal to change Western support for Ukraine is unlikely to happen. But then the amount of damage that will happen along the way is very much there.
Yeah. Let's take some questions. We'll take some from the room, and we can also get them from viewers online. I want to start with the room. Let's start with this gentleman here. And please introduce yourself. Please make your question brief so we can get lots of them in. Thank you.
Right, my name is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Alex Fanos. I used to work at the Foreign Service Institute. I want to look at the future after all this passes. What do you think would be a creative way of reestablishing relations with Russia, between the West, the US, and Russia, the creative lifting of sanctions and so forth, so that we avoid the influx of dark money and corruption, organized crime?
Who wants to tackle that? Creative way.
I say one thing. I don't see a creative way. I would say that if people believe, and there are people in Russia who believe that, okay, when Putin is gone, the next leader, whenever it's somebody from the Putin circle or a democratic leader, can blame it on Putin. And then in a Cold War way with Bush 41, there will be a strategic agreement because the US want this country back into the family, and then it doesn't want Russia to become beholden to China. The problem here is that Ukraine will have a vote, and Ukraine's position on this will be paramount important. There will be no reconciliation, no effort to bring back Russia from the cold before the Ukrainian demands are addressed. And whether that implies all of the demands, as the Ukrainians put it, is questionable. But without serious diplomacy around this, nothing is possible in my view.
The other thing to add is just kind of looking at where you mentioned dark money. I mean, the anti-corruption agenda has moved tremendously since the war began, both here in the United States. We've got the klepto capture, lots of legislation being passed on the Hill. The same is true in the UK and all over Europe. So I think they're always trying to find the silver lining of these horrible things, but you think about what that sets us up for the future. A lot of these kind of modes of influence that the Kremlin has had, both in the United States, but especially in Europe, are starting to be addressed. And I think then when we get to another point where we talk about reestablishing a more stable relationship with Russia, a lot of the foundations have been improved on the US and Western side. The energy lever, Putin's ability to wield that in the future, the leverage that he has derived historically from that is now severely diminished, and I don't think it will ever come back. So a lot of these fundamentals and kind of the health of democracies, or at least our guardrails to that unwanted Russian influence, I think we're in a really different place than we were historically. And so that at least provides a good building point to get to that future place that you're talking about.
You had a question here?
Dave Mahler from Axios, and thanks about the very helpful.
want to talk about, we talked about Putin's options for escalation. I guess there was this narrative early in the war after Plan A failed that if Putin wanted a way out of this war, he could define victory. Anti-Nazi, agenda was successful. We have some territory in the Donbass. I guess after both the counterattack, mobilization, annexation, has he put himself in a position where victory is defined for him and he has to secure all of this territory, or does he still have some wiggle room in terms of what victory looks like?
I can take this maybe, if you don't mind. Yes, just one of the Putin's advantage here is the vagueness and indefinite character of the goals of this war from the very beginning. So basically, you can describe as a victory almost everything. They started from the Blitzkrieg, quick war for 3 days. Then they were talking about the liberation of Donbass and saving the Donbass people from the Ukrainian shelling. There is a land corridor to Crimea. Then there is a term, name of Novorossiya, again in the game. But there is another victory that Putin can ascribe to him, and his supporters can support him in this. It's the very resolve to break with the West, very resolve to go into the open conflict with the West, which was at least, before the mobilization, very popular idea among maybe the majority of Russians, or the important sector of the Russian public opinion, supported by the official propaganda. So Putin is good, at least before the mobilization, was a good Tsar, a good Russian leader and patriotic Russian leader, just because he has broken openly with the West. So by the very resolve is his victory.
Let's take another here, and then we'll go back there. Here, sir. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Mark Tokolov from the Korea Economic Institute. Should the EU be talking about accession of Ukraine to the EU? Should they move ahead with that? Or that just poison relations with Russia for decades to come?
I mean, yes, I do. I think, the Ukrainians have been really clear that they see their future trajectory as closer integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions. And so, I think it's hard, it's the right thing to do. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but I think that absolutely is something that will help them lock in a more prosperous and democratic future. Having those guardrails, having to accede. We've seen the way that enlargement has worked in the past, setting countries on this kind of democratic trajectory. So to me, I think that is the way, if we are going to come out of this with any kind of silver lining, firmly anchoring Ukraine in the West, setting up an example of a prosperous democratic society that can serve as kind of a kind of focal point in the region. There is good political science research that talks about how regime type tends to converge within regions. And so having a Ukraine that is anchored firmly in the West can provide positive examples to Belarus and Georgia and Azerbaijan and others in the region. So as a long-term strategy, keeping with the values of the West, it does seem absolutely like the right thing to provide that opportunity to Ukrainians if they're meeting the criteria.
In the back here, and I just want to remind, sir, in the last row there, you've had your hand up, and I want to remind anyone online, we'll be able to take some questions from you, so please submit them if you haven't.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and my question really goes back to the subject of the program today. A few weeks ago, the World Health Organization Director General compared the situation in Ukraine as sleepwalking into nuclear war, which anybody who's studied the history of World War I knows this was a euphemism for each side saying, act tough and they'll back down, show them how mean we are and they'll retreat and blah, blah, blah. We know the result. And just listening to the panel, knowing nothing really about the subject matter, it seems like the only option Putin would have to end the war would be Kyiv. Anything else would give him all of the blowback of using a nuclear weapon, but it wouldn't end it. That would end it. So my question is twofold. First, I'm sorry to put the panelists on the spot, but for those of us who are not experts, putting you on the spot is important. What would you give the probability that we are, and I mean actually give the probability of that we are heading towards a nuclear conflict as a result of what's going on in the Ukraine? And secondly, if one were to start, Putin took out Kyiv and we took out Vladivostok, could it be stopped? So the two questions. First, give us a probability so that the average person can understand what this means. And secondly, if it starts, can it stop? Thank you.
Who wants that?
I think that I think that the probabilities are off. It's just like we are picking any number. The problem is that they have been in single digits 2 weeks back. They are probably in double digits, and I don't want to point. The risks have gone up significantly, and that's something that should give everybody a pause and probably call to action. On the second question, that has been modeled many times, and the number of outcomes when it doesn't stop is really worrying and should, again, force everybody to be creative and not stigmatic about it.
Either of you see that differently?
I would probably put the probability still in the single digits. I agree that the probabilities have gone up with the illegal annexation of these territories and the extension of the nuclear umbrella. My sense too is that they've gone up, but I would still put them in the single digits, in large part, for all of the reasons that we've talked about, the downsides for Putin using a nuclear weapon. And I still think that there are lots of things that he can do. And Sasha talked about some of the different ways that he could escalate short of nuclear war. I still think that we're a long ways from there. And I do find the kind of the U.S. intelligence kind of community's reassurances that there are still no signs, right, that anything is that Russia's nuclear posture has changed substantively. I still take some comfort and reassurance in that, but I still think that there are many things that Putin could do short of nuclear escalation to accomplish some of his objectives. And again, this question of whose side is time on is a hard one. My sense is in the very long term, time is on the Ukrainian side. But as Sasha said, if mobilization can prolong this conflict, and you're not talking about getting through this winter, but next winter, there's ways that, and we haven't really talked much about the economic ramifications of this on Ukraine. It is devastating to the Ukrainians' economy. And so that also plays in Putin's favor, the damage that he's doing to their economy and whether or not the West can sustain the financial support just to keep Ukraine afloat. So there are things that he can do to really drag this out. Mobilization will help with that. So I still think there's a lot of objectives that he can accomplish without having to resort to these.
And the big unknown is the military toll that this is taking on Ukrainian side, because we're seeing a lot of evidence of damage, destruction, death on the Russian side. But I think that on the Ukrainian side, the picture is not as clear.
Alexander, let's get you in on the next one, but I want to make sure we get as many questions as possible. I think we're supposed to turn to online questions, so my apologies. If we can squeeze a couple more from the room at the very end, we will, but let's do a couple for people who've been patient online.
Sure, we have one question from online. Why can't NATO give fundamental assurance of a nuclear response to a tactical nuclear exchange to prevent Putin from crossing the line on nuclear use?
So, Alexander, why don't you talk about whether we're NATO, if I understand the question correctly, were NATO to issue an ultimatum vowing a nuclear response to a Russian nuclear strike or demonstration or whatever it is, do you think that would affect Putin's calculus? In other words, I suppose the question is, would it be useful for NATO to be a little more Russian-style bluster?
Mm-hmm. Well, I cannot say what NATO should do. I just want to answer this question. I would add something to the previous question. If you follow the discussion in the ranks of Putin's critics from the right, so those who criticize Putin for not being resolute enough in his war efforts, and they want to exhaust several options before using the nuclear weapons, and one of them hitting the thermal power plants in Ukraine. those who know the Soviet Union know that all big cities are supplied by electricity and the heating from these central stations that basically it cut almost all population of big cities from the heating and the electricity. Another are bridges over Dnieper. Another are crossing points of another target. I mean, for those to be heated before before the nuclear option. The border crossing between Ukraine and Poland and all these supply lines. So basically, before they go, and even the mobilization is the sign that Russia is serious enough in its nuclear threat, because if you just go to the nuclear threat before doing more elementary, more simple things, you don't look serious. So we have just time and space before they really go to this. We saw how Putin was reluctant to proceed to the mobilization. I think, well, we have the same space, same time to before he comes to the moment when he decides to use or not to use the nuclear weapons. And in this particular time, all signals, all threats, or coalitions that dissuade him to do so are useful, of course.
Yeah. I just make really two quick points. Number one is it's in no one's interest for the United States and Russia, or NATO for that matter, to be duking it out in public. And so I think that's why you see the United States taking the path of having these quiet, private discussions where we can clearly communicate what the threats would be. So having NATO make some statement in public is really counterproductive, I think, for everyone. And then the other point too is, like, we are definitely kind of at a crisis moment, and we're thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. But one point to emphasize is I think that this kind of nuclear saber rattling and the threat of Russia's use of a nuclear weapon is something that we're going to have to get used to for a while. Mm-hmm. And so, as you know, one of the things that people are coming to talk about much more is, as Russia is degraded, its military is degraded in conventional terms, the more it's going to have to double down on the non-conventional, including nuclear weapons. So I think this is something that the more vulnerable Russia feels in the wake of this war, I think this is something that's kind of here to stay for a little while.
Let's squeeze in a couple more if we can. We'll take another online question. We're down to the last few minutes here, so we'll do a lightning round if we can.
Sure. So Chris Bort on YouTube asks, Andrea, what do the Ukrainians understand by win? How much of a win will they be satisfied with?
I think Sasha answered it. Good to see you, Chris. But Sasha answered it. I mean, right now, I think Zelensky and the Ukrainians are at a very different place than they were earlier in the war, where they were talking about different agreements that were on the table. Those are now off the table. And so, but I think the demands that each side will make are directly tied to their position on the battlefield. And so, coming off this counteroffensive, the Ukrainians believing that they can win, their position therefore has changed. And so they are talking about the restoration of their territorial integrity to include Crimea, reparations, and accountability for war crimes. And I think that is where they are. They're very public about that being where they are, but we should expect that these things do change and they are very much tied to where each side is on the battlefield. The Russian position has changed.
Mm-hmm. Let's just try to get a couple more in.
Sure. So we have one from YouTube. Sorry, 1 second.
It's all right. Thank you, everyone who's watching, and for your questions. We appreciate them, and they've been great questions.
So the question is...
Let me take one from the room. How about you right here? And we'll come back to that one.
Future kind of unconventional great.
We are having a piece of Sergei Vakulenko on Carnegie Politica that I mentioned that's in works. I think that we don't know the facts yet, but it's safe to assume who was behind it. You need to escalate on multiple fronts and to show that there is point of no return, that the energy crisis will be really severe. There is no physical way to turn on the pipeline. So you can either unfreeze the Yamal pipeline that goes through Poland, or to find a way to stop the war and unfreeze the Ukrainian pipeline. But without that, woo, it's getting really, really scary. And then there is a technical argument. Gazprom is also now claim force majeure to abandon all of the payments that would result for not meeting the contracted volumes. That's a kind of side thing. But I think that it's much more not commercial, but geostrategic, and it's part of the broader hybrid war.
And it's the point of, like, again, the more degraded and vulnerable they are in conventional terms, the more they're going to double down on these non-conventional things. And we should expect this to continue, if not kind of intensify in coming months and years.
We're right at time. With the permission of our hosts, we'll go back to that online question, which will be the last one.
Sure. So Anand on YouTube asks, does the annexation mean that this is the extent of Russian ambition in Ukraine? Perhaps this is his plan B.
Alexander? Oh, go ahead, Alex, and then Alexander.
Well, the annexations are basically the referendums and the annexation has three obvious goals. One is to counterbalance the military defeat in the Kharkiv region. That's clear. The other one is to boost the fallen spirits of collaborators and pro-Russian citizens in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Of course, the mood is different. I mean, it's not that pro-Russian that Putin expected, but there are some collaborators and there are some pro-Russian citizens, though they have to be convinced that they won't be left behind. And just to create a new situation on the ground, both in or possible talks or in threatening the West or in threatening the Ukraine, and then just the annexation turns the offensive war in a defensive war of Russian borders whenever they are a defense of Russia's territory. It's even something superstitious in this, because Russia can lose a war or some military expedition outside its borders, but Russia always wins a war when it's waged inside. So invasion, foreign invasion. They're trying just to turn this aggression, war of aggression, in a sort of defensive war, more legitimate than the eyes of the citizens. And like, again, I say something superstitious and mystic about this.
Great point. And Alex, this will be the final word.
My point is that it's not where Putin stops unless he stopped. Had he not been pushed out of the Kharkiv Oblast, there will be a referendum in this part of Kharkiv Oblast, no doubt. And had been pushed as far as Nikolaev and Odessa, which have been declared by some Russian military commanders, all the way to Transnistria, there would be referendums there as well. So that justifies the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So there is no stop to the appetite of Vladimir Putin, maybe except with the Western Ukraine.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank our panelists so much. What a great conversation. I wish we had another hour to so many more questions we could ask. Thank you all, the audience here, the audience online. You asked great questions. I wish we could have taken more. Thank you to Carnegie. And this ends the event. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
These nuclear questions are so hard.
How are you? Nice to see you.
The nuclear
Make my job
questions
easy.
are so hard.
I'm on the plane.
The nuclear questions.